I use a dating site to hopefully find a decent person to go out with and to try to make connections. This dating site sadly has a lot of duds and very, very few decent folk available on there. However, I remained optimistic and kept going back to check messages and things. I received a message from a normal-looking guy who seemed to have a lot of good things going for him. After a bit of talking, I felt really comfortable giving him my personal phone number, something I rarely ever do. We talked on the phone and found we had a lot of things in common. Both of us were nerdy and had some form of a collection of nerdy things. At that point, I really wanted to meet him in person, so we set up a day to go out for some brunch at a local place. He told me he was excited to meet me, and I told him the same. On the day of the date, we had our lovely brunch and talked about various things. He was an extremely tall guy, built like an ox. It was almost a little intimidating, but I do like some tall guys, so that didn't matter too much. After some talking, he got a text from his mom asking him where he was at, and that she needed him to come help her with his dad. He told me after the conversation with his mom that his dad was not doing so well, and was basically in hospice care at home. I gave my condolences and said it was fine to cut the date off short, so he can go take care of his dad. I even told him that I'd like to see him again sometime soon, when he was available, which he felt the same about. As we left the restaurant, and I headed to my car, we ended up stopping for a short time and conversed just a little bit longer. But then, all of a sudden, he asked me if I wanted to feel him. I was taken aback by what he said and asked him what he meant. It was so out of nowhere that I didn't think he meant his groin. I looked around the parking lot nervously, looking to see if there was anyone nearby that I could flag down for help. Sadly, there was no one, so my attention turned back to him. Afraid of what he might do, and him waiting there expectantly for me to touch him, I shakily reached my hand and tried to aim not directly upon his crotch. Then I announced, "Oh yeah, sure can feel it." I laughed nervously and lied. But then he forcefully grabbed my hand and brought it to his groin. Thankfully, I still didn't feel it, as I still kind of aimed offset. He asked me if I feel it now, and I lied once again and said yeah, I felt it. I was so afraid and was at a loss for words. He towered over me like a skyscraper. If he wanted to, he could have easily lifted me up, put a hand over my mouth, and shoved me into his car without breaking a sweat. To cut the awkward silence, I said, "Well, I better go now." He said goodbye and left to go to his car, and I torpedoed into my own car and locked the door as soon as I sat on the seat. My hand shook as I grabbed the steering wheel and headed home, glancing into my rear mirror to make sure he had not followed me. When I got home, I washed my hands thoroughly, even though I didn't actually touch him. Just the thought of it had made me sick, and washing my hands made me feel at least slightly better than before. After that day, I never texted him back or answered his phone call. Now, here's where things got more scary. So, I knew what his name was, and he had mentioned what his dad's name was, but on my own I discovered what his middle and last name happened to be. I then used his full name to look up any sort of criminal report or any information I could obtain about him. I needed to know everything, especially if he was a criminal. First thing I saw with his full name was an article about a woman whose body was found on the side of the highway, in a sleeping bag or a black bag. As I read the article, I noticed certain names being used. First off, his name. It matched. Then later in the article, after reading about what he had done to the woman, they had a portion where the journalist spoke about his parents. Then his dad's nickname came up. The same name he told me his dad's was. To seal the deal that this was the same guy, were that the dates and his age matched up. He went to prison for only 10 or less years. When he got on the dating site and talked to me, he must have just gotten out of prison about a month before. It all hit me like a ton of bricks all at once. I just went on a date with a man who killed a woman, and he never told me. Had I had known beforehand, I never, ever would have gone out on a date with him. I would have never given him my personal number. Since then, I've hoped he hadn't searched for my address. Suffice to say, I rested uneasy for months since discovering his crime. When I was single, I ventured into the world of online dating and stumbled upon a guy named William. Our initial interactions seemed harmless enough as we exchanged messages. But one day, things took a bizarre turn when we exchanged numbers and he initiated a call. During our conversation, he adopted an unsettling demeanor, referring to me as his pet, subjecting me to a weird intelligence test. Despite passing the test, his behavior grew increasingly strange. One particularly alarming proposition involved his desire for me to visit him and star in a homemade horror film, wherein he envisioned me as a belly dancer performing in scenes of a questionable nature, including a chilling scenario of bathing with him in a tub of fake, or so I hoped, blood. His unsettling ideas even extended to plans to lure me into the woods to experiment with hypnosis using an emerald necklace. Feeling deeply unsettled, I made the decision to sever ties with him. As I went to his profile to block him from further contact, curiosity led me through his photos first. What I discovered only fueled my unease. He was a bald man, adorned with tattoos, sporting eerie white contact lenses, and posing in unsettling scenarios, such as a, hopefully fake, blood-covered garage while wearing a ski mask. Without hesitation, I blocked him, hoping to leave this creepy encounter behind me. Years later, just when I thought I had escaped his eerie presence, fate threw an unexpected curveball. While I was driving home from the mall, a vehicle pulled up beside me. To my horror, it was William. His eerie grin and knowing wave sent shivers down my spine. I watched him as he sped off. The memory of our strange conversations and his eerie demeanor came flooding back to me. That night, I made sure all my doors were locked, and I double-checked the windows. I couldn't help but wonder what could have happened if I had agreed to meet him in person. But I was grateful for my instincts that led me to block him all those years ago. From that day on, I was a lot more cautious about who I interacted with online, realizing that not everyone is who they seem to be. I believe I came across a matrix glitch at a mall I was going to with my friend. After me and my friend got some pretzels and drinks, we started walking, going window shopping. Then the lights at the mall shut down, but no one reacted, nor said a word. Me and my friend were the only ones reacting and questioning this. After 2 minutes, the lights went back on. What was strange was that everybody seemed like they were frozen like statues after 5 seconds once the lights turned back on. Then everything went back to normal. I still talk about this to my friend. No one else believed me. It still gives me the creeps, and I tend to question reality now. Picture this. I'm a 15 to 16-year-old girl. It's the middle of the winter, around 7 p.m. I'm coming down with a mild cold. My parents aren't home, and my sister is off at a school event. So I take this time to take a long bath and to try to soothe whatever is in my system. About 10 minutes into my bath, I hear a frank knock at my front door. This doesn't strike me as too odd, as everyone in my family has a tendency to lose everything. I get out of the bath and put on a robe, and am about to walk up to the door when something stops me. I'm not sure what, but I get the urge to check in with my parents. I grab my phone and text them something along the lines of, "Hey, are you locked out?" The knocking at the door got louder, and my dog, who is crated, barks. My phone rings, and my dad responds with, "Nope, I'm still at my sister's school event." My dog barking made me nervous. She's not a necessarily quiet dog, but she never barks at my family, or I. I decide to just tiptoe out of the bathroom and into my sister's room, which is right next to the front door. I look through her blinds and see a man at my door. My heart drops. This isn't my mom, or anyone I know. It's a man wearing all black, with ragged hair, a crowbar in his hand, and what looked like a gun in his pocket. He pounds on the door this time. I see he's using both of his hands to do so. My dog starts going crazy at this point. Once she starts up, I see the man step back and back into a car in the front. Another guy jumps out and walks up onto my porch. I decide that's enough. I run over to my dog's crate and let her out. She's not a large dog, but she's a loud one. She starts jumping at the door, barking so much she has to take labored breaths and growling through the crack that reaches to the outside. I hear a faint, "Oh fuck, nah," before I hear a car door slam and the crunching of gravel, a clear sign that the car is left. My dad rushed home, and I frantically explained what happened. We searched our front yard and porch to check to see if they had left any evidence. The only thing we found? Dents where the man pounded on the walls. One summer evening, I was about 9 or 10. There was a bad accident about 2/10 of a mile from our farmhouse. The accident was at the corner of two roads. We lived way out in the country in the Midwest. We weren't home when it happened, but I could see the aftermath later that evening. The next day, out of curiosity, I asked my mom if I could ride my bike up to the corner. She said yes, but don't go further. She was hanging laundry on the clothesline and kept an eye on me as I rode up. We lived in a really safe area where my brother and I rode our bikes all the time, so I wasn't scared. I get to the corner and get off my bike and start looking around at some of the leftover debris. Nothing much, but as a kid, you're just curious. As I'm looking around, two creepy guys in a station wagon pull up. I felt bad vibes right away. They asked me which one of them was cuter. All I could think to do was run, hop on my bike, and ride as fast as I could towards home. Fortunately, their car was facing west on a gravel road, and I was headed east down a blacktop road, so I got a little head start. As I looked back, I could see them turn around and start following me. I started screaming at the top of my lungs as I was pedaling as fast as I could. My mom saw me and started running towards me. When the car got a little ways down our road and saw my mom, they stopped, turned around again, and headed the other direction. My mom called the police, but there was not a lot they could do. but they did take the info. To this day, that whole incident and their faces are burned in my memory. When I hear stories of little girls being abducted, I think that could have been me. This is a story my dad told me many times, and I thought I'd share it with y'all here. In 1966, when my dad was little, around 13 to 14, he had begun reading what I'd like to call no-no books. Black magic type evil books. One night, around 2 to 3 in the morning, my dad got up to use the restroom. When he came out of the restroom, he heard what sounded like whispers coming from his room. At first, he thought it may have been my grandparents talking in their room. But as he sat and listened, he noticed it was coming from the opposite side of the room, from where his parents' room would have been. My dad finally pinpointed where it was coming from. The upper corner, where the walls and the ceiling meet. My dad told me he did not recognize the language the voices were speaking. He said it sounded like a dead language, one not spoken for 1,000 years. The voices also came through with a heavy hint of static, like an old radio station that's hardly in range. Freaked out, he called my grandfather to come in there. My grandfather opened the door and froze. "Who's in here with you?" my grandfather asked. "I don't know," my dad said, pointing to the corner of the room. At this point, the whispers had evolved into normal speaking volume. My grandfather walked in and listened for a moment. "What have you been doing in here?" he asked my dad. Without speaking, my dad pointed to a book beside his bed. My grandfather, a pastor at their church, his face grew very pale. My grandfather grabbed the book with one hand, and his cross he wore around his neck in the other. My dad and him walked into the living room. My grandfather built a little fire in their fireplace. At this point, my grandmother came out in her robe and asked, "What's going on, Don?" My dad, "I told you no TV this late." My grandfather looked at his wife in horror and said, "Honey, that's not the TV." Once the logs in the fireplace began to burn, my father tossed the book inside and waited. Once the book began to catch fire, the voices turned to screams that rattled the windows. They lasted about 7 seconds before everything went silent. I asked my grandfather about this story. He would always cut me off and snap, "We do not talk about that night. Period." My grandmother said pretty much the same thing, only nicer in her granny way. My dad told me this story 12 times, and it always captivated me. What were those voices? What were they saying? Was my dad close to opening up some kind of a portal? I don't know. But I do know he never picked up a no-no book again. This is one of the most creepy and traumatizing things that has ever happened to me. I was staying with my family, mom, dad, grandma, grandpa, in an A-frame chalet-styled cabin in northern Washington. Washington has a lot of forests and densely wooded areas. This cabin was also on a lake, and we brought our small lake boat with us. This trip was mostly so we could try out our new boat, mind you. Everything was going well. We were having fun on the lake, hanging out with family, and just generally having a good vacation. My family decided to go to a convenience store and leave me alone in the cabin. This happened a while ago, but I was old enough to stay home alone. The nearest convenience store was about 30 to 45 minutes down a dirt road. As you may have expected, this is where it started to go wrong. They leave and I volunteered to stay home because I am relaxing and I don't want to get in the car. About 15 minutes after they leave, it started to get dark. I'm walking around listening to music and enjoying the sunset, perfectly framed over the lake. Chalets generally have pretty large windows, and this specific cabin did not have curtains. This made watching the sunset pretty enjoyable, but did not help once the sun fully set. Washington is known for its forests and also known for Bigfoot. This story is not related to Bigfoot, as it's just a legend. I'm just pointing out for a reference. So at this point, I am messing around and exploring the cabin more, because the sun is now set and there isn't really much besides dark, kind of creepy forests and the lake outside of the window. As I am messing around, something catches my eye. I swore I could have saw a very slight movement down by the small boat dock, about 125 meters down a small windy path. I didn't really think much of it, as I was in the forest, and there are many animals that could have been moving around. Deer, moose, etc. At this point I had forgotten about the movement I saw, and headed to the bathroom, which is down a hallway away from the window. While I was in the bathroom, I just got this terrible feeling, like something was wrong. Wanted to go check to see if there was anything inside the cabin, or anything outside. I couldn't do this, however, because I was, well, using the bathroom. The longer I stayed in the bathroom, the worse the feeling got. Every drop of rain landing on the roof felt like the tick of a clock, counting down to the end of the world. I quickly finished up in the restroom and practically sprinted down the hall. I looked out the large set of windows and saw nothing but the lifeless forest and the moonlight reflecting off the lake. I then started to feel that stereotypical feeling of being watched. Generally, nothing is watching you, or so you think. This time, there was something watching me. I turned around and looked down the hall at the other clear glass door at the end of the hallway. Standing on the other side of that door is a freaking deer, standing on 2 legs. My mind instantly screams, "Skinwalker." I try not to acknowledge it. I close my eyes and sprint back to the bathroom, locking myself in the bathroom as it is the only room without windows. I sit there in silence, barely breathing for what felt like 12 years. My family finally got back, and I came out of the bathroom. Nothing was there, and after checking the next morning, there were no signs anything had ever been there. You can choose whether to believe it was all in my head, but even if it was all in my head, it still truly was a scary experience. This was about 2 years ago. And for some context, I'm 16 as of now, and when this happened I was about 14 and a half. Growing up, I lived in a bad neighborhood, in a bad area, so it wasn't safe for someone my age to be walking around alone, especially at night. For some context, this takes place after school. I had just gotten out of school one day, and normally I would take the bus home. But on this day, I decided I wanted to hang out with some of my friends instead, so I did. My school had a park and a corner store pretty close by, so we went to the corner store after school, and then we went to the park to play some basketball, because one of my friends had brought a basketball with him, and we played for a few hours. Before we knew it, it was dark outside, like 7 or 8 o'clock at night, but we weren't too worried, because we didn't have school the next day, as it was a Friday, and most of us had a ride, except for me. So I waited around until everyone had gotten picked up and gone home, and then I decided to start walking home. My house was about 30 minutes away from the park, so it was a long walk, and about 10 to 15 minutes into my walk, I felt uneasy. I had a feeling that I was being stared at, and I was hoping I was wrong and that it was just nerves. But I checked over my shoulder and noticed a tall, older man following me. I was terrified, and I didn't know what to do, so I kept walking and pretending that I didn't notice him. But at some point, I heard him speed up and walk faster. Eventually, he started running towards me, and I just started bolting as fast as I possibly could. But he caught up to me and tackled me to the ground. He had a knife and tried to stab me in the face, but I put my arm in the way to defend myself, and thankfully, a man saw it happen and chased the guy away, then called 911 and came to check on me. The guy had gotten me pretty good in the arm, and I'd cut everything inside of my arm, as I was bleeding badly, but thankfully the ambulance came in time to save me, and I was okay. But now, I am really terrified to walk home alone at night, so I carry a knife on me at all times, just in case. After this incident, I moved away to a different state, in a safer area. And still to this day, I have absolutely no idea why this guy did this to me. He didn't try to rob me, or kidnap me. He just attacked me. And it's always kind of bothered me not knowing why exactly he did that to me. A couple of summers ago, me and some of my buddies would go to a large abandoned factory that had been burned down due to smoke, and would hang out together without anyone bothering us. The front of the factory was still standing, and we had found an entrance into the front, and we had all been inside multiple times, except for one of us. This night was just like any other night, without anything unusual about it. Somehow, the topic of mystical creatures had come up, and I asked my buddy Jay what skinwalkers were, and if he believed in them. He was very shocked, and told me not to say it out loud again, to which I said, "What, skinwalker?" To which I was told, "Dude, just shut the fuck up." I found it amusing that him and my other buddies Justin and Bobby took something so silly so serious. I let it go, but my other friend Tristan wanted to poke some more fun at them. "Oh no, look at me," he said, before he began to whistle and mockingly say, "Skinwalker," a couple of times, while simultaneously walking into the middle of the factory. This part of the factory was burned down, and had no roof or walls. It was just some grass in the middle, and bricks around the perimeter. I'm watching Tristan walk into the middle of the factory, when he suddenly stops and freezes. I'm I'm still looking at him, trying to figure out what he's doing. He then begins to walk back and looks at me and throws his hands in the air while pointing in a circular motion as he mouths some words that I couldn't understand. I said, "What?" And he repeats himself more clearly and says, "Get in the car." To which everyone except me frantically did. We took 2 separate cars to the factory, so I drove Justin and Tristan to where Justin's car was, so they can both leave. Justin hops out of my car and sprints to his and starts his car. Tristan opens the back door to get what I believe he told me was his jacket, and he gets up to go to the passenger seat of the car. But before he could even take a step, his head darts to the left, and he then jumps in the back seat of the car and screams, "Drive!" and they speed off. In this current moment, I'm a little scared, but mostly confused about what's going on. I didn't take off very fast because I had to turn my car around to start driving toward the exit. I'm now looking in my rearview mirror at Jay and Bobby, asking them what had happened, or if they saw why Tristan jumped in the back seat. I see Bobby turn his head around in my rearview mirror to look behind us, and shortly after, he whips his head back around and screams super loud, "Dude, floor it!" And I do. We all end up rendezvousing at a local market to figure out what had happened. I asked Tristan what had freaked him out so much. This honestly really concerned me, because neither of us were superstitious at all. He told me and the others that he heard something like a twig snapping when he froze, and looked toward the front of the building, which only had 2 staircases on the left and right side, and an elevator shaft in the middle. He then explained that he saw a silhouette of a tall, thin person on the highest floor in the middle of the building, where the doors would have been, and then disappearing. Tristan had never been inside, though he thought he saw someone standing on the 3rd floor, to which Jay explained that there was no floor there, and that it was an empty elevator shaft. We are all shaken up now. I also asked him why he screamed "drive" at Justin, and jumped into the back seat of his car, to which he explained he heard what he thought was someone, or something, sprinting towards his direction, and that's why he jumped in. I then asked Bobby why he asked me to floor it, to which he said that he saw some long, skinny, humanoid-looking thing sprinting at my car on all 4s really fast. And that's my story. I think maybe it could have been some homeless person sprinting on all 4s at my car, but that doesn't explain Tristan seeing the silhouette of someone standing in an empty elevator shaft. So the year is 2016, and I think it was September. My parents, the family dog, and yours truly went to France for a vacation. My mother had picked a nice-looking holiday home, close to the French city of Auvergne. So we arrived there, and the landlady greeted us. Communication was a little odd, since she was French, and my parents speak very little French or English, and I couldn't speak English too well either, as I was 12 back then. Though both I and my parents remember how she kinda nervously explained that we definitely have to activate the alarm system every night and to lock the doors leading to the lounge/winter garden with a large metal shutter that, at least to a 12-year-old me, reminded me more of blast doors. Another thing that struck my parents and me as odd was that we weren't shown all of the house. So, with my dad and I being curious, we tried to look around some more and found some odd shit. There were 2 upstairs bedrooms and 1 on the ground level. The bedroom on the ground level was normal, apart from the window not closing properly. But the upstairs bedrooms were kinda odd. One of them had 5 or 6 beds, of which none of them faced each other. We shrugged it off as the beds being arranged in odd ways. The second bedroom had a very large bed and a second door, standing to the left of the bed. The door was locked. We weren't given a key for it. A similar door was across the upstairs hallway, next to the bedroom upstairs. It apparently led to a small balcony, which also led to another door, which obviously couldn't be accessed either. The creepiest part, though, was the basement. So we weren't shown the basement by the landlady, but the key fit, and me and my dad went down there out of curiosity. It was a stairway that led into an L or Z-shaped basement. It was pretty normal at first, but the end was concerning. The last part of it was tiled, and had a very amateur mosaic of a red figure with black hair, which seemed like a woman to me and my dad. My dad also claimed that there were what looked like meat hooks in the walls, when talking to him about that. So for some goddamn reason, we stayed there for the week, and some really odd things happened. First of all, we all had a pretty scary feeling when it got dark, which in a house that throws so many red flags at you, is kinda normal. Secondly, I am like 80% sure I heard some noises coming from that locked door in the upstairs bedroom, like a creaking of some old floorboards. I also felt pretty watched, and a little, depressed, which is odd for a vacation. Feeling like that could be normal though, since I tend to have paranoia from time to time. So maybe that was just a little bit of paranoia showing early in my life due to the circumstances. Lastly, and this was the most scary thing that happened, our dog, an English Labrador Retriever, who is usually the most chilled creature on Earth, had what basically boils down to the dog version of a panic attack in the middle of the night. I was in another bedroom, so this relies fully on the accounts of my parents. But basically our dog started to wail and seemed extremely scared in the middle of the night, waking up my parents. He seemed terrified and kept howling and wailing for around 2 hours, refusing to go back to sleep before finally calming down. I can confirm that this dog never reacted to anything like that. No fear of fireworks, no fear of water, no fear of loud noises, nothing. We stayed there the whole week, but we were glad when we left. I still dream of that house to this day, and I feel shivers running down my spine when thinking about it. Anyways, I hope you all have a nice day, and that my story could bring you a little bit of entertainment. Back in 2014, I was out camping with my friends in the Amamore region of Queensland. There was Phil and Tony, my UTE, and an esky full of grog and sausages. We were set for a good campout. We were driving through the forestry, through some of the four-wheel drive tracks, and found a secluded spot by a creek to set up camp for the night. We were sitting around a fire, having a Barbie, and a couple tinnies, and sitting back having a fish. We were catching mostly dewfish, except for one fair-sized bass and a turtle. Sometime through the night, everything seemed to go silent. It was a fairly bright night, and earlier, the birds were crying out, frogs were frogging, crickets were chirping. Now, as we were all getting tired and conversation lulled, we noticed it. Silence, except for the fire and the sounds of the creek. It was unnerving. Phil noted it out loud. and the unease in the glances between each of us made the moment feel more tense. It was broken when a loud splash sounded from up the creek. It was like a massive rock was thrown into the water. We all gazed toward the sound, but nothing could be seen. We assumed it was a fish jumping in the creek, or a branch falling, or something like that. After a few terrifying minutes, the sounds of the animals began again, and it was as if the silence never was. We put off sleep for a while, to clear the nerves. Tony hooked something big, and we excitedly watched as his line snapped. While Phil and I tried casting out, we both caught nothing but snags. We set up swags in a triangle around the fire, and decided to call it a night. Within minutes, Phil was fast asleep, and snoring loudly. I was gazing up at the stars through the fly screen, just about to drift off to sleep, when I noticed that silence had returned. It was only Phil's snoring, and the lapping of the water along the shallows that sounded. The fire had died down a bit by now, and the wind was still. I could hear sporadic things, leaves scuffling, twigs breaking every now and again, isolated nature sounds amongst the silence. My heart stopped when I heard some stones on the riverbank move. When it sounded again, not once, but twice, I began to hold my breath. Initially, I shook my head at myself. It was just a critter of some sort, no doubt, but the back of my mind was telling me it sounded awfully like footsteps. I took shallow breaths as I waited for the sound again, but it was silent for a good minute. I had finally just began to breathe normally when I heard the sound yet again, but from the other side of my swag, a few meters away. I could hear sniffing, then the sound of stealthy movement as this thing creeped across the ground toward my swag. The flap was pulled down, so I could see the sky and the fire. The other side was still covered. I could hear this thing breathing heavy breaths on the other side of the canvas. Then I hear the sounds of something touching the canvas itself, centimeters from my face. At the time, I assumed it was a wild dog, or perhaps even a pig, maybe. Unlikely, but my head was swimming. The sniffing sounded peculiar. The nostrils sounded large, like the breathing was more hollow. I could see the canvas moving in towards me, as whatever it was inspected my thin cocoon. I felt trapped. The canvas was moving toward the mozzie netting, and then I saw it. Brownish yellow long fingers with obsidian black nails. I'm not gonna lie. I screamed the loudest, highest pitched squeal I think anyone could manage. I flipped shit. I started kicking and flailing. Tony let out a, "What the fuck?" before an even more expressive, "What the fuck?" before flipping out like I was. I heard a loud sound from the distance, and the thing that was above me ran away from our screams across the riverbank and loudly crashed into the water. Phil began shouting as he awoke to our panic and hearing the splashing. Tony and I had already scrambled out of our swags and were legging it to the car. I could have beat Kathy Freeman that night. Phil joined us as we shouted at him to get the fuck over here. He didn't need much persuasion, as he had looked at our strawn belongings and terrified faces. We got in the UTE, leaving our stuff behind. My dad was pissed, because it was his swag I was using, and as I turned on the headlights, a yellowish-brown and abnormally tall shape of a person moved behind a large tree. Phil saw what we saw this time, and started going mental. I floored it through the forestry. I fucked some panels, and my suspension hated me for it, but we got the fuck out of that forestry. Every creek crossing was terrifying. We finally got off the dirt roads, and were heading back toward town. We crossed a small bridge, and from one side to the other was a trail of splashed water, as if something, or someone, dripping wet, moved from one side to the other. It could have just been water, but after what we saw, we were convinced it was the same creatures. Tony said later on that he saw the thing crouched over my swag when I screamed. He said he had his eyes closed and was listening to the sounds of a weird swirling in the water. He said he never heard footsteps. He told me the creature had overly large eyes, was all cheekbones and head ridges. He reckons it was an alien. I reckon differently. That was the last time I went out camping with the boys. I later moved to the city, but whenever I go back near the area and drive over a creek or the river, I'm waiting to look down and see eyes staring up at me from the water. I don't know what it was, and honestly, I don't plan on finding out. I don't go near bodies of water anymore. Even the beach gives me the heebie-jeebs. Does anyone know what the fuck we came across that night? I haven't heard of anything remotely similar to this anywhere around here. When we tell people, they think we're talking shit. But we all saw something, and we all agree it was human-like. But it was no person. The creek leads into the Mary River, that is home to prehistoric creatures, like the lungfish. All I know is something strange lives in those depths. If you're still listening, and you've made it this far into the video, I really appreciate your time, and I hope you've enjoyed. Please consider subscribing and leaving a comment down below. This will help me to feel motivation to continue to make more videos. Thank you, and have a good night.